Alrighty, and we're going to kick off with history of the African country and their trade methods. Presenting are myself, Henry Hudson, Marcellus Hughes Brewster, April Jett, and Adam Jordan. We decided to go back to the late 1800s because of the crises that the African people were facing, as well as the economic trade issues that began the continuous problems that Africans are seeing to present day. Africa just has this long history of oppression and victimization based off of greed from other countries, specifically the East as well as Europe had a issue with coming in and controlling what Africa can do with their own resources. Everything from agriculture, trade, and a major issue was that the foreign folks were bringing in laws that were just a disadvantage to the African people in entirety. We went far as back to 1869 because the Suez Canal that Egypt decided to connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, which created a gateway between the north, the east, which connected to the south. And that is a very big situation because it's 120 miles long. And if you can overlook the 10 years of slave labor that built the Suez Canal, then you can look at the advances such as that with the East India Trading Company, which provided all the major accessories at that time, copper, ivory, oil, anything of that nature, which also prompted the Belgian King Leopold II to launch he called it a mission to improve the lives of the African people, but also create a Belgium in which is viewed on a high pedestal. So, to keep Belgium on this high pedestal, he sent a lot of the white male mercenaries, etc., of that nature, to go to Africa and force them into uh, slave trading, as well as to dig as much resources as humanly possible. And the quotas that were, quote, human possible did not seem reasonable. And therefore, he decided to go into very aggressive measures by cutting off hands, murdering, and massacring the entire Congo. So 1884 rolls around. People start to realize how profitable Africa can truly be, which brings along the Berlin Conference, where 14 European countries, as well as the US, which included very largely known countries such as Russia, Great Britain, as well as other um, countries like Belgium was there, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Norway, the Union, and Russia were some of the major players. And the main reason of that conference was to avoid feuding and war over Africa. And a thing to mention was Africa was there. Technically, it was 15 members, but Africa was not regarded, even though it is their country that is going to be absolutely mutilated for its resources. So a few years goes by, they hash it up, fight with it, and they pretty much rape Africa of their resources, and they punish anyone that gets in the way. And then on top of that, the countries that were peaceful, such as Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Italy, etc., they were known to bribe any tribe members or leaders of those groups with food, water. I remember a story of where they traded copper for labor, and it wouldn't even be worth a penny today's time of copper. Um, And on the other end, these tribes would also look at how these foreigners would come in with their weapons and the stories of them going into neighboring countries in Africa and mutilating the entire masses. So the focus really was on these coastal territories, which did connect along the Suez Canal, which is why it's so important. Many of the internal African countries were not touched because they were not deemed profitable. But in later times, that did change with the Congo. So the colonization purpose was basically just for the simple trade holding routes, but also to mostly benefit the outsiders and go from that route. So looking back, um, Africa started to realize that independence was a thing around the late 1940s, which at this point, 1940s is relatively close to one of the world wars. So you can really tell along the northeast, which is here you got Egypt, and then along the Suez Canal, which runs through here, you can see a lot of the independence was earlier rather than around the Congo area and then into South Africa, which was heavily held by European countries. So, a lot of the independent states of Africa, the promotion was to accelerate the trade between the African states, but also because a lot of these European countries, as well as the West, realized that maybe massacring African people for their benefit wasn't the greatest thing to do.
Hmm. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff about the fights for independence, like how Kenya was Kenya's first president was Jomo Kenyatta, which makes sense since he led them in their fight of independence against the British, and how his catchphrase that basically means like all pull together. But what's more important for like the economical side of things, in my opinion, is actually what General Motors did, and how they had a lot of a effect in trying to develop South Africa, and even adopted principles by a American Baptist minister who argued that they could ethically work in South Africa as long as they adhere to certain rules, and they did not adhere to the apartheid laws, which were a series of laws in South Africa about segregation. Some of Sylvan's rules actually were non-segregation, equal employment practices, equal pay, and employee education, along with a few other things, which was very interesting. So the West African basically economic union is a very interesting thing to me, because essentially just like how with like the EU, the West African countries decided to form a like together as a economic unity or community, and but unlike the EU, they did it for like very different reasons. They actually wanted to ensure like the prosperity of each of the countries with each other, so they formed unions so they would have easier to trade with each other as they all just like became free. It helped with their development of industries and telecommunications and basically every important facet of life, like energy and agriculture. 1981, it was actually concluded that the two original rules established, Sylvian principles established weren't enough to ethically have justify the presence of American companies in South Africa. Just two principles wasn't enough to break down the systematic segregation in the country. Um, it wasn't, however, until state pension funds and the like, more the like governmental institutions of other countries announced that they no longer would hold any stocks, that actual companies were persuaded to withdraw from doing operations in South Africa themselves.
The advantages and disadvantages of regional trade agreements. The advantages are reduced barriers to trade among members of countries. Countries can source goods and services from low cost areas based on competitive. Disadvantage political interest, conflict zones, and unwillingness to comply with agreements and title agreements. Popularity increased in the 1990s and still exists today. Rise of economic power. 1991 of June Treaty and the creation of free trade areas, custom union, and African Central Bank and African Common Currency Union. Release of control. In 1994, South Africa would lead democratic elections. The loss of companies, economical sanctions by U.S. and other governments, and displeasing white minority rule, and aggressive pave rule.
Two men who brought tremendous change to South Africa were Frederick William de Klerk and Nelson Mandela. F.W. de Klerk was born into a political family in 1936, and after law school and running his own successful law firm, de Klerk entered the political roles as minister in 1979. While sitting in the white minority government of parliament under President Botha, he supported and even enforced apartheid. After President Botha resigned, though, de Klerk became the 7th state president of South Africa, and he really surprised the African citizens when he completely changed his views on apartheid. This was in an attempt to avoid racial civil war, and this is why he decided to end this policy. With the transition to universal suffrage, de Klerk legalized anti-apartheid political parties. He permitted marches and activities that countered apartheid that had never been permitted before. He also dismantled the nuclear weapons program. Also during this time of transition, de Klerk freed many activists, one of which was Nelson Mandela. In 1993, he publicly apologized for the harm that apartheid had caused and the effect that it had had on Africa. Then in 1994, he oversaw the first non-racial election where Mandela was the leader of the African National Congress, and he ultimately won the presidential election. De Klerk became his deputy president. Mandela was born in 1918 to a royal South African family, and after he graduated from law school, he became involved in the African nationalist politics in the 40s. In 1956, he was charged but acquitted of treason, and although he was involved in nonviolent protests and activities, he was also associated with a militant group leading a sabotage campaign against the government. His involvement in this was met with a sentence of life in prison, but ultimately he only ended up serving 27 years before de Klerk released him in 1990. Throughout his life, though, he was an activist to his core. De Klerk and Mandela struggled in their negotiations and had some tension in their business relations, but ended up winning collectively the Nobel Peace Prize for their contribution to ending apartheid. And this was in 1993. Although Mandela was previously affiliated with the South African Communist Party, in 1994, he was elected the first Black president in a democratic election to the African National Congress. The East African Community, also known as the EAC, was founded in 1967. It collapsed in 1977, and then it was revived in 2000. Originally formed in 1917 by Kenya and Uganda, Tanzania joined them in 1927, but this customs union did not gain momentum until the 1990s. Their objectives were for prosperity, competitiveness, security, stability, and political unification in East Africa. Some of the goals for this community were to establish a customs union in 4 years. This did not happen, and as that mark came and went, an attempt to re-energize the free trade movement in Africa happened when Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania actually committed themselves to relaunching their bloc 24 years after its collapse. Some of the goals also would include creating a regional court. This court of justice was established in 1999, but they didn't hear their first case until 2005. Another goal would be for creation of a legislative body. The Legislative Assembly was founded in 2001, and it has 62 members, 56 of which were elected, and then 8 were non-elected committee members. The political federation was the ultimate goal of creation. This was also the 4th step to follow customs union, common market, and monetary union. The political federation was put in place to create cooperation and communication in capital markets, and this was to include non-discrimination of nations of the partner states, equal treatment of nationals, transparency in matters concerning partner states, and also to share information for execution of the protocol. Some of the failures would include the hindrance of industrialization and lack of capital and skills, corruption, high levels of debt, and criminal behavior. Another failure would be that the benefits have not been equal among the partner states, and effective tariff reduction has not been what was promised. After 2 years of negotiations, there's a failure to meet the 2012 target for monetary union. The EAC was unable to agree on the conditions, so they just removed it from the summit agenda at that time. Tripartite Free Trade Area, TFTA, is a proposed African free trade agreement between the common markets for Eastern and Southern Africa, Southern Africa Development Community, and East African Community, and it is comprised of 26 nations. This agreement that links 3 existing trade blocs affects 632 million people. With this agreement, there was a pledge to remove and reduce tariffs and eliminate time-consuming custom procedures, and it's also seen a steady increase in exports ranging from 2.3 billion in 1994 to 36 billion in 2014. Because of the TFTA, there's a GDP of 1.3 trillion and 102 trillion in trade among member states, covering an area that's actually twice as large as China. In 2018, there were 44 nations who signed the TFTA Pact to establish free trade. Nigeria was not one of those states. The AFCFTA is the African Continental Free Trade Area, and this is an agreement that would make the largest trade agreement in the world if it's measured by participating countries. Some of the advantages would include reduction or complete revocation of trade barriers and World Trade Organization support in developing economic transformation and diversification within the 44 member countries. The 10th Extraordinary Session ACFT agreement took nearly 40 years to implement, but once it was launched, 44 out of the 55 member states signed the agreement establishing the AFCFTA. The Kigali Declaration was signed by 47 member states, and that was to unite the nations in the fight to combat tropical diseases and to secure commitment to achieve sustainable development. Protocol on Free Movement of Persons was signed by 30 member states, establishing that everyone has the freedom to have a residence anywhere within the borders of their state and the freedom to leave that country and return to his own country. Some of the failures would include member states still not being agreeable to proposals due to the tariff revenue losses and uneven distribution of benefits, and members not happy with the WTO and their speed of change. African Continental Free Trade Area outputs would be my last slide that I'm going to talk about today. And with the AFCFTA creating the largest free trade area in the world, the pact will have the capability to connect 1.3 billion people across 55 countries, and it will allow for a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion US dollars and have the potential to lift 30 million people from extreme poverty and raise the income for 68 million others, reshaping the regional economy and boosting output in services, manufacturing, and national resources.
All right, so COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Probably the most recent thing that you could probably say is a major event affecting any given economy, given that at least here the pandemic is still going on, and in some regions of the rest of the world it also is continuing. But anyways, when looking at how trade changed in Africa in the pandemic, the 2 main exports that were found to be defining factors of how a country was doing were gold and oil. Countries that were major exporters of gold actually found their exports rising in value as the demand for gold went up and the supply of gold went down. However, countries that specialized in oil found their value of their supply actually going down, because while the demand for oil didn't change all that much, the supply was still very abundant with other countries, and there was easier transportation from some of those other regions to supply oil to the rest of the world than Africa in the height of the pandemic in Africa. Additionally, like many places, Africa took a large hit to their tourism area, which makes sense given the pandemic caused a lot of places to close down, and at the height of it, you couldn't even travel between countries. So, well, not mentioned here, speaking of travel, about a third of all profits made on travel in Africa was lost during the pandemic, which is interesting in a way that transportation profits were only reduced by 33%, considering that a lot of places were just completely shut down. Something that I thought was interesting was that the trade between African countries didn't actually suffer as badly as the trade between African countries in the rest of the world, which I believe would most likely be from the length of the trips required for those two things, and that the crew of, say, a cargo ship or a plane, if you try to fly supplies across, but most likely cargo ships, the crew of cargo ships and the like to other countries probably were far more likely to all get infected on the length of their trips than somebody in a truck by themselves driving between African countries on land was likely to infect others. So shipping and the like took a much bigger hit, and therefore inter international trade between African countries and non-African countries will of course take a bigger hit than intra-African countries, where they could just take a single person could take a truck and by themselves drive across the area. So it made sense. Sadly, though, Africa's African countries trade with each other isn't as major as their trade with other people, which other countries, which makes sense considering their African countries as a whole can their two major goods can be mostly summarized in just oil and gold. So if you have gold, you don't need gold. If you have oil, you don't need oil. So there wouldn't be too much trading between those two products. And I mean, there would be, but there are only two products, and a lot of other products that Africa trades in, other African countries also have. So it wouldn't make much of a difference. That good?